So you know what they say, all flooding is local. And today I'm going to be talking to a woman named April O'Leary, who has developed and currently leads a group called Horry County Rising. The goal of Horry County Rising is to raise the awareness of the public and homeowners about the flooding potential here in Horry County. We'll see what the group is doing, and we'll see what the plans are for the future. I hope you enjoy it.
So I'm April O'Leary. I'm the founder and president of Horry County Rising, and I'm here to talk with Dr. Luken today about what our mission is and what we hope to do. Our mission is to prevent catastrophic damages to Horry families that is caused by flooding. And we do that through a number of different ways with our values and actions. So we focus really hard on preventing those damages caused by flooding, looking and analyzing the problem and the cost to our communities, identifying what the problems are, and then obviously also working for solutions. So we do that through a number of different goals and priority projects. One of the things that we did is a study where we partnered with the Climate Cost Project to really analyze and understand better what the costs were to Horry families. And so we discovered through that study that 30% of the families that are affected did not receive any type of assistance to help recover or rebuild. 2/3 of those families took on debt to recover and rebuild. 30% lost all of their savings. So these are families that are on fixed incomes like retirees or younger families. 7% of the funds that Horry County did receive were used to mitigate future risk, which is really concerning from us as far as making sure that we're prepared for future flood events. And then we see a huge significant loss of wealth after a flood. A lot of the families lost about $150,000 in wealth after they flood. These are families that are even, under a flood insurance policy with NFIP. So what's the problem? Well, we're experiencing above normal rainfall. Floods are obviously really natural, but it is becoming an increasing issue with the type of rainfall events that we're having, where those rainfall events are becoming more frequent and more intense. Flooding itself, from a 30,000-foot view, costs the U.S. taxpayers about $850 billion since 2000 in the last 20 plus years, and it counts for the 2/3 of costs of all disasters. So we know that flooding is really scarring our communities. It's inundating homes, it's cutting off families, and there's a lot of financial and emotional distress caused, countrywide, but also countywide in Horry County. The vast majority of flood victims are uninsured. So, that is telling us that we're really underestimating flood risk and who's at risk. And 1/3 of the Horry families affected living in a flood zone are only required to carry flood insurance. So again, we're really underestimating what is at risk. So the scale and scope is really significant. Many people think that this problem only occurs in coastal communities like Horry, but it's actually happening in the United States all the time. 81% of our families flooded 2 or more times in recent years, 17% flooded 4 or 5 times, and at least 146,000 residents in Horry County, about half of our population, are either inconvenienced or inundated because of flooding. So the problem is getting bad. We know it's really, worse, and the flood events are really becoming more severe, more intense, and more damaging. So a couple of other things that contribute to increasing flood risk is where we're constructing new homes. A lot of these areas are high risk flood zones. And so that's something that Horry County Rising works really hard on. We're also increasing impervious surfaces, so we're not really offsetting those additions. And then, we're creating this sort of network of flood highways where the water really just doesn't have any place to go. Again, NFIP really defines bare minimum standards that municipalities need to adopt. Horry County Rising is working really hard to increase and enhance those standards, but we're still designing to that 100-year flood standard since 1973, and we're not really accounting for actual flood risk. We know that folks that are outside of that special flood hazard, the majority of them are actually being impacted by floodwaters. So we really didn't pick the right standard. Another problem is that we're not investing enough in our water infrastructure. Our infrastructure and stormwater infrastructure was really built yesterday, many years ago. And so it's really not ready for today, and it's definitely not ready for the future. So we're relying on that critical stormwater infrastructure that was built really and constructed almost 100 years ago, and it's really nearing the end of its life. Federal income and investments toward this problem are really limited, and it's really hard to get those federal investments into communities that are impacted. Just a local example, when Congress allocated $150 million to the counties that were most impacted after the 2018 flood, we still haven't received those monies. So families are still waiting this many years later. So we know that a lot of these communities are already disadvantaged. Many of them have already flooded multiple times since that major flood event that we saw in 2018. And the federal government is really overstretched and is having a difficult time with building enough capacity to really get monies into these communities. So the more we're delaying, funding investments for our local infrastructure and doing more mitigation projects, we're delaying the problem, and we're going to end up paying a lot more on the front end. So how do we put our goals into action? Some of our goals include increasing investments, having better flood policies that are not as outdated, and then identifying solutions based on community feedback and input. So our values also include making sure that we take care of our own. So this is the 146,000 residents that are affected by flooding. You don't have to necessarily have floodwaters in your home. You can be inconvenienced by flooding where it's difficult for you to get to school or to work. And then we invest in communities that are affected. That's a real priority value for us, making sure that we're funding projects that reduce flood risk and damages in those communities that are most vulnerable. So how do we get there? Well, together we make it happen. We have to plan, we have to improve, and we have to protect. And we also, I think, repair would be good in here. A lot of times after a flood event, we have to do a lot of repairs to our stormwater infrastructure, but really, continuing the cycle of planning, improving, and protecting our communities. So one of the things that Horry County Rising worked really hard to do is demand a plan. That means that we're pushing Horry County government to make sure that this is a #1 priority, that we're working with residents to demand positive and immediate solutions, and to have a plan, knowing that the decisions that we make today will have an impact for generations to come. So we don't remain silent on the subject, and we're not waiting for change. We're demanding that change and putting our values into action. How do we do that? Well, our strategy is to pressure elected officials to fund flood mitigation projects, invest in smart infrastructure, and ensure that we do responsible, smarter, low impact development principles to make sure that our county is future-proof against flooding. So we work with a lot of local experts and networks, flood networks throughout the nation, folks and individuals like the Association of State Floodplain Managers, hazard mitigation specialists with FEMA, long-range planners. So we work really, really hard to identify experts that we can work with, information that we can share, and identify solutions to our local flood problem. We also organize our members, making sure that members attend council meetings, town halls, webinars, and that's a service that we provide to all of our members of Horry County Rising. We also measure our progress. So we really figure out how we're doing on flood funding and flood policy, and so we can make sure that we're holding our politicians accountable. We also do a lot of, we provide a lot of digital tools to make it easier for our members to really amplify our voice. At right now, present 85% of our users, rely on social media and, wish to have some type of tool to make their voices heard. And that's one of the tools that we provide all of our members. So this is basically our roadmap to, how our strategy. So the first thing we need to do is plan, make sure that we have a plan to reduce flood risk and damages, and then obviously protect and ensure that new development does not make situation worse. Investments, increasing our investments to save money in the long run, and then obviously improve the situation by providing resources to enhance our stormwater infrastructure. We launched in April 2020, and basically the first thing that we did was demand a flood plan. So that is something that we were very successful. Right now, the county is working on drafting a flood plan, and I'll get into more of that here. And Horry County Chairman Gardner established a subcommittee to advise staff in drafting and adopting a flood plan for Horry County. Horry County Rising, myself, is appointed to that flood committee. Because of the pandemic, we got a late start, so we didn't start convening until January of this year. You convene monthly, and we review different solutions and policy ideas to reduce flood impacts. Some of the solutions, flooding is a very complicated situation, and so what we have tried to do is simplify the message and making sure that all of our solutions are really common sense and something that's supported by many. Making sure that we use a simple framework. A confused mind never buys. So what we ask for is really just common sense. And making sure that our members know what questions are the right questions to ask. We're not trying to do the government's job. It's their job to do that. But we do try to provide solutions as well to assist them. So what does a flood plan do? It identifies true risk, right? How many properties are really at risk from flooding? Is flooding getting worse? Is it getting better? And clearly communicating what that true flood risk is to families and businesses that live in Horry County. And then also making sure that we take action to reduce risk and do risk reduction goals. A flood plan would also define priority projects that help us with those risk reduction goals. So it would lay out solutions, what the costs would be. It would include some guidance on how we prioritize those projects, whose jurisdictional control we're seeking, and the responsible entities. And then it identifies what projects are actually viable. So we can do a cost benefit analysis and make sure that we're not throwing good money after bad, and we're really investing in those communities that are most impacted. We also want to make sure that our flood plan specifies optimal land use and guides good land use policies, making sure that we have smart rules around development to prevent flood risk increasing. It will also keep the public engaged and make sure that the plans are really simple. They're available on public websites. They're referenced in communications with our citizens and in council meetings and whatnot. So we know if we have a good flood plan and we start investing more in mitigation, it's going to cost us less in the long run. So for example, if we were to enhance our building codes, $1 investment in constructing those homes, maybe to a higher elevation standard, could save us about $7 of a cure. It also creates a lot more jobs. So this is just kind of defining what some of the studies have shown. So some of the solutions that we propel, things like breakwater, riprap, seawalls, levees, and spillway gates, these are what we call gray infrastructure projects. And these are nature-based projects that we support. So this is like working to make sure that we're strengthening our barrier islands, doing beach restoration activities, creating oyster beds, helping to protect forests that really help us with some of that absorption. Tidal marshes also act as a barrier. And we also work to put forth, things like landscape channels. For example, my source of flooding is Crabtree Canal. What type of restoration activities could we do on Crabtree Canal to really help it to be, conveying water in a more improved conveyance and basically more improved storage. Things like rain garden and bioswales, doing more to protect our rivers and our local wetlands, doing stream restoration projects on places like Buck Creek and Simpson Creek, and then obviously using our parks and open spaces to give us more opportunity to have better buffers. We also work on stormwater retention, capturing more rainwater, addressing impervious surfaces. Not everywhere we can use gray and green infrastructure. And so sometimes, we do have to construct canals, so making sure that we bring the water away from homes and investments, stormwater pumps. So we are a growing community. We have about 25,000 members, and on social media and our Facebook group, we have about 4,000 members, and we're all fighting together for better flood protection. So what are some of the current projects that we're working on? Well, right now we're really proud that we worked closely with realtor.com and floodfactor.com to really identify what's at risk so we can make sure that unsuspecting home buyers are not buying a product that floods or not buying in a neighborhood that maybe have road access issues. So one of the things that we did is work with realtor.com to show what's actually at risk, and what's at risk has been defined by flood factors. So we're really excited about those. I'll also show you Horry County also, because of our efforts and because we've amplified our voices, Horry County is now also showing what's at risk. They have a new website called Map Your Move. You can see what roads were closed in Hurricane Matthew. You can see where the inundation areas are from Hurricane Florence. You can Google any address and it gives you that information. You also have your evacuation zones, and we really hope to use this tool to add even more. Like, for example, if we're going to do stormwater projects, we want to make sure families know what type of infrastructure projects or enhancements are happening in their watershed that would have a great benefit to them. Another thing that Horry County is currently working on is increasing our elevation standard. Right now we have a campaign called Don't Build in the Swamp. What we're really saying in that campaign is we really would rather not homes go in these areas where we know there's risk. But at the same time, we know we can't really limit that because landowners have property rights. So if we are going to build in these areas, we want to make sure that the homes are high enough. So Horry County Rising is pushing for a 3-foot elevation standard, which is an increase from what our 1-foot elevation standard is now. Another thing that we're pushing for is making sure that we adopt the special flood hazard zone that was mapped by FEMA, but also the supplemental flood zone. The supplemental flood zone refers to the inundation areas from Hurricane Florence. So we're pushing the county to adopt both. What that means is once they're adopted, our regulations will apply to these zones. And we're also trying to push the county to addressing filling in the flood zones. We know by bringing in fill, it gets us the elevation we need, but it can also increase water velocity and water levels on those fringe flood areas for families that are living adjacent, upstream or downstream. So these are just a couple examples of our current projects. Thank you so much. And that is basically our presentation. Just to kind of let you know where we are. We have a website, horrycountyrising.com. We're on Instagram. We have a Facebook group called Horry County Rising, and we also have a Twitter account.
Great. While I'm watching this, of course, I'm thinking you hit all my points, but there's one question I do want to ask. So as I drive around, even in my neighborhood where I live, I'm starting to see these signs pop up all over the place that say flood voter.
Oh, great. Well, you'll see.
And they really are popping up all over the place. All right. So can you tell me a little bit about how you, what's behind that, and how'd you get so many people on board with that?
Well, I think, especially since 2015 with Tropical Storm Joaquin and then Hurricane Matthew, and then after Hurricane Matthew, I mean, even my own neighbors were like, well, that's the worst we'll ever see it, right? And then all of a sudden Florence came, and that was almost 3.5 feet higher than Matthew. I mean, yeah, Matthew. I'm a little tongue-tied today. So, but I think, families have really suffered quite a bit, and they understand that they're very vulnerable to flooding, that we're very vulnerable. Just in February and March of this year, as you covered in your video, we had close to 100 local roads that were closed due to flooding. In Hurricane Florence, we had 260 local roads that were closed. Thousands of families had floodwaters in their homes and were displaced for months. So I think a lot of families, whether they may be inconvenienced by it, with those road closures, they may have been impacted, or they may have known somebody that's been impacted. And they're very eager to do more for flooding. And so we are working really, really hard to make sure that we are pushing this issue and making it a top political priority for our elected officials. And we're not going to elect anybody unless they're strong on flooding. And so we want to make sure those officials understand that we're going to vote. We're going to hold them accountable. We're going to make sure that they do everything they can to protect our most precious investments, which is our homes and our families. And we're going to make sure that they don't make the situation worse by putting future families at risk, which is why we're doing our Don't Build in the Swamp, right, campaign. And so these are all our kind of clever, cute, fun way of getting people excited about the issue, engaged in the issue, to push for better flood protections.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, April. You presented us with a lot of information, and I learned a lot from your presentation. And I tell you, seeing those signs up, I tell you right now, I've never seen anything like that around here before. It tells me you're having some success in getting people on board with this issue. So thank you very much for sharing what Horry County Rising is doing.
Thank you.